The autumn wind cut through the apple orchards of Millbrook Valley, Oregon, carrying with it the scent of ripening fruit and the whispers of desperation. Emma Chin stood at the edge of Sullivan Orchards, her weathered job application clutched. In trembling hands, 7 months pregnant and penniless. The morning mist clung to the trees like secrets waiting to be discovered, and somewhere among those laden branches, her fate would be decided. What she didn't know was that David Sullivan, the enigmatic owner watching her from his estate window, would soon claim her as something far more valuable than a seasonal worker, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose a conspiracy, reaching into the very heart of Millbrook Valley's power structure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel crunched beneath Emma's worn sneakers as she approached the hiring office, a converted barn that had seen better decades. Her back ached from the weight she carried, both the physical burden of her pregnancy and the invisible load of her circumstances. The baby kicked against her ribs, a reminder that time was running short. She had exactly $47 to her name, an eviction notice folded in her back pocket, and nowhere else to turn. Inside the barn, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of dozens of hopeful workers. The air smelled of coffee, anxiety, and the lingering sweetness of processed apples. Emma took her place in line behind a group of seasoned pickers, their hands already stained from years of harvest work, their Spanish flowing in quick, worried conversations about housing and wages. Rosa Martinez turned around, her kind eyes immediately taking in Emma's condition. At 53, Rosa had worked these orchards for nearly 2 decades, and she recognized desperation when she saw it. "First time picking?" she asked gently, her accent soft but her English precise. Emma nodded, suddenly feeling foolish. "I saw the advertisement in the paper. It said no experience necessary." Rosa's expression grew concerned. "Mija, this work is hard, and in your condition." She gestured delicately toward Emma's belly. "I don't have a choice," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter around them. "My husband died 3 months ago. Car accident. The insurance company found some technicality to deny the claim. I've lost everything." The woman ahead of Rosa, Maria Rodriguez, had been listening. At 45, Maria had raised 3 children, while following the harvest circuit, and her maternal instincts were finely tuned. "What was your husband's name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Michael Chun. He was a financial advisor in Portland before." Emma's voice trailed off, the wound still too fresh to examine closely. Maria and Rosa exchanged a meaningful glance, something passing between them that Emma couldn't quite interpret. Before she could ask what they meant, the line moved forward, and Emma found herself facing a clipboard-wielding supervisor who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Emma Chun." His pen paused. "Chun? As in Michael Chin?" Emma's heart skipped. "You knew my husband?" The supervisor's face flushed, and he suddenly became very interested in his paperwork. "I'll need to see some ID, and you'll need to pass a basic physical examination before we can consider you for any positions." The medical examination took place in a small trailer behind the main barn. Dr. James Mitchell, the company physician, was a thin man in his 60s with gentle hands and tired eyes. He'd been conducting these pre-employment physicals for Sullivan Orchards for over a decade, and he'd seen his share of desperate people seeking work. "Mrs. Chun," he said as he checked her blood pressure, "I have to ask, are you sure about this? Apple picking is physically demanding work. At 7 months pregnant, I'm not certain I can clear you for field labor." Emma sat on the examination table, her hands pressed against her belly. "Doctor, I need this job. I don't have anywhere else to go." Dr. Mitchell finished his examination in silence, his face troubled. Finally, he set down his stethoscope and looked directly at her. "Your husband, Michael Chun, he came to see me about 6 months ago, not as a patient, but to ask questions about worker safety protocols here at the orchard." Emma's breath caught. "What kind of questions?" "He was concerned about chemical exposure, particularly to pregnant women. Said he was representing someone, but he wouldn't say who. He was very thorough, very professional. I got the impression he was building some kind of case." The trailer door opened before Emma could respond, and the supervisor stepped inside. "Doc, we need to move this along. We've got 50 more people to process today." Dr. Mitchell nodded curtly. Mrs. Chun is cleared for light duty only. No ladder work, no heavy lifting, no exposure to pesticide applications. Emma's heart sank. Light duty typically meant sorting damaged fruit or cleaning equipment, work that paid a fraction of what the pickers earned. The supervisor made a note on his clipboard and handed her a packet of paperwork. Report to the North Fields tomorrow at 6 a.m. Rosa Martinez will be your crew leader. Welcome to Sullivan Orchards. As Emma walked back toward the parking area, Rosa caught up with her. Where are you staying tonight? The question hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd been avoiding thinking about it, hoping something would work out. I'm not sure yet. Maria appeared beside them, her own paperwork completed. There's a motel about 10 miles from here. Clean, cheap, but on your wages.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She didn't finish the sentence. I have some money saved. Emma lied, touching the thin envelope in her pocket that contained her last $47. Rosa studied her face. You know, there's something about your husband's name that sounds familiar. Where did you say he worked? Pinnacle Financial Services in Portland. He specialized in corporate consulting, risk assessment for agricultural businesses. This time, both women stopped walking entirely. Maria grabbed Rosa's arm, and they began speaking in rapid Spanish. Emma caught only fragments, something about contracts, about problems, about danger. What is it? Emma asked. What aren't you telling me? Rosa looked around nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Your husband came here last spring, not to the hiring office, but to the worker housing. He was asking questions about working conditions, about safety violations, about how much money the company was supposed to be spending on worker protections. He was investigating Sullivan Orchards. Not just investigating, Maria said quietly. He was building a case. Said there were going to be major changes, that workers would finally get what they deserved. Then suddenly, he stopped coming around. We heard he'd been in an accident. Emma's mind raced. Michael had never mentioned working on anything related to agricultural labor. His clients had been banks, investment firms, insurance companies. But then again, in the weeks before his death, he'd been distracted, working late, taking phone calls he wouldn't discuss with her. Did he ever mention why he was investigating? Who hired him? Rosa and Maria exchanged another look. He said he couldn't talk about it, but that it was bigger than just Sullivan Orchards. Said there was money missing, lots of money, that was supposed to go to worker safety and housing improvements. A black sedan pulled into the parking area, its windows tinted dark. Emma noticed it immediately because it was the only expensive car in a lot full of beat-up pickup trucks and aging sedans. The car parked near the main office, but no one got out. We should go, Rosa said suddenly, her voice tight with worry. As they walked toward Rosa's truck, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation crawled up her spine like ice water, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly. The black sedan remained in its parking spot, engine running. Rosa drove Emma to the Pineview Motel, a faded establishment that had seen better decades but was clean and reasonably priced. As Emma counted out money for 3 nights, all she could afford, Rosa touched her arm gently. Emma, I need you to be careful. If your husband was really investigating the company, and if something happened to him because of it. She didn't finish the thought. You think his accident wasn't an accident? I think in places like this, people who ask too many questions sometimes have bad luck. That evening, Emma sat on the edge of the motel bed, her laptop open on her knees. She'd been avoiding going through Michael's files since his death, but now she had a reason to look. She started with his work computer, which the police had returned along with his other personal effects. Most of the files were exactly what she'd expected: client reports, financial analyses, risk assessments for various businesses. But buried in a folder labeled Personal Projects, she found something that made her hands shake. A comprehensive investigation into Sullivan Orchards and its parent company, Blackwell Agricultural Holdings. Michael had documented everything: safety violations, missing funds that were supposed to improve worker housing, illegal use of pesticides near residential areas, and systematic exploitation of migrant workers. But it was the final document in the folder that made Emma's blood run cold. A draft letter addressed to the Department of Labor, outlining criminal charges that should be filed against Marcus Blackwell, the owner of Blackwell Agricultural Holdings, and his local partner, David Sullivan. According to Michael's research, over $2 million in federal grants intended for worker safety improvements had been diverted into personal accounts. Workers were being housed in substandard conditions while the companies claimed full compliance with federal regulations. And the pesticide exposure issues Dr. Mitchell had mentioned were just the tip of the iceberg. Emma scrolled through page after page of evidence, her husband's meticulous work painting a picture of systematic fraud and worker exploitation. At the bottom of the final report, she found a note in Michael's handwriting, evidence package delivered to contact at DOL, expecting federal investigation to begin within 30 days. You will be safe once this goes public. The note was dated 2 days before Michael's accident. Emma closed the laptop and stared out the motel window at the darkening orchard landscape. Her husband had been trying to protect her and workers like Rosa and Maria. He died before he could see justice served, leaving her pregnant and penniless, not knowing that she carried more than just his child. She carried the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single apple orchard. A soft knock at her motel door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Rosa standing outside, looking nervous and glancing around the parking lot. "Rosa? What's wrong?" "Let me in quickly," Rosa whispered. Once inside, Rosa pulled the curtains closed and sat across from Emma. "I couldn't stop thinking about what we talked about today, about your husband and his investigation. I found his files tonight," Emma said quietly. "You were right. He was building a case against Sullivan Orchards and their parent company. A big case." Rosa nodded grimly. "I thought so. Emma, there's something else you need to know. After your husband stopped coming around, we had federal investigators show up asking questions. But then they left suddenly, and we never heard from them again." "What do you mean they left suddenly?" "One day they were here, interviewing workers, taking photographs of the housing conditions. The next day, they were gone." Maria heard that their investigation had been called off due to lack of evidence. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Someone buried the investigation. That's what we think. And if they could make federal investigators disappear. Rosa's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Why are you telling me this? You barely know me." Rosa's weathered hands folded in her lap. "Because tomorrow you're going to walk into those orchards carrying his child. Because you have a right to know what you're walking into. And because maybe, just maybe, you can finish what he started. I'm 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go. What could I possibly do? You could survive long enough to have that baby and make sure the truth comes out. But first, you need to understand who you're dealing with." Rosa pulled out her phone and showed Emma a news article from 6 months earlier. The headline read, "Local financial advisor dies in single car accident." Below was a photo of Michael's crashed car, wrapped around a tree on a winding mountain road. "This is the same road where 2 other people died in the past year," Rosa said quietly. "Both of them had been asking questions about working conditions at various farms in the valley. The police always call them accidents. Bad weather, dangerous roads, driver error." Emma stared at the photo of her husband's destroyed car, seeing it with new eyes. "You think someone killed him? I think your husband found something that powerful people didn't want found. And I think you need to be very, very careful about what you do next." As Rosa prepared to leave, she handed Emma a business card. "This is my cousin's number. He's a lawyer in Portland, specializes in worker rights cases. If anything happens to you, call him immediately." "Rosa, why are you helping me?" The older woman paused at the door. "Because I have daughters your age. Because I've watched too many good people get hurt by bad men with money. And because maybe it's time someone fought back." After Rosa left, Emma sat alone in the motel room, her hand resting on her belly. The baby was active tonight, turning and kicking as if sensing her mother's agitation. She thought about the job application in her purse, about the morning that would bring her face to face with the people who might have killed her husband. She could leave, pack up her few belongings, drive away from Millbrook Valley, and never look back. Find somewhere else to start over, somewhere safe. But as she looked at her husband's research spread across the motel bed, as she thought about Rosa and Maria and all the workers who had no choice but to keep coming back to these orchards despite the dangers, she knew she couldn't run. Michael had died trying to protect people like them. His child deserved better than a mother who turned away from injustice. Tomorrow, she would report to Sullivan Orchards. She would pick apples and ask careful questions and watch for opportunities. She would be the pregnant widow applying for work, vulnerable and desperate. But she would also be Michael Chen's wife, carrying his evidence and his determination to see justice served. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent, as if agreeing with her decision. Emma Chen closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would begin the most dangerous chapter of her life. Outside her window, the apple orchard stretched endlessly into the darkness, their shadows hiding secrets that men had killed to protect. But somewhere among those trees, the truth waited to be harvested, and Emma Chun was ready to pick it. Dawn broke over Millbrook Valley with the crisp promise of autumn, painting the apple trees in shades of gold and amber. Emma stood at the edge of the north fields at 5:45, 15 minutes early, watching the sun climb over the Cascade Mountains. Her breath formed small clouds in the cool air, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her swollen belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the importance of this day. Other workers began arriving in clusters, their voices low and their movements efficient. These were people who understood that every minute counted when you were paid by the bucket. Emma recognized Rosa's weathered pickup truck pulling into the dirt lot, followed by Maria's ancient Honda with its distinctive rattling exhaust. Rosa approached her with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression. "How did you sleep, Mija?" "Not much," Emma admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "I kept thinking about everything you told me. Today, you focus on the work," Rosa said firmly. "Watch, listen, but don't ask questions yet. These orchards have ears, and some of them report back to management." Maria joined them, carrying a worn canvas bag that clinked with the sound of picking tools. "The crew leaders are coming," she said quietly. "Remember, you're just another worker looking for a paycheck." Emma watched as several supervisors emerged from the main office building, clipboards in hand, their faces already set in the professional indifference that separated management from labor. She recognized the man who had processed her application the day before, but there was another figure walking beside him that made her breath catch. David Sullivan himself strode across the field, his presence commanding immediate attention from every worker present. At 42, he was younger than Emma had expected, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He wore expensive jeans and a flannel shirt that probably cost more than most workers made in a week, but he carried himself like someone comfortable in these surroundings. "Morning, everyone," Sullivan called out, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group. "We've got perfect weather for picking today, and the fruit is at peak quality. I want to remind everyone about our safety protocols, especially those of you who are new." His gaze swept across the workers and stopped when it reached Emma. She felt exposed under his scrutiny, as if those sharp eyes could see through her pretense of being just another desperate job seeker. For a moment that stretched too long, they stared at each other across the morning mist. "Mrs. Chun," he said, and the use of her name sent a ripple of surprise through the nearby workers. "Would you join me for a moment?" Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to walk steadily toward him. Rosa's warning about these orchards having ears echoed in her mind. Behind her, she could sense the other workers watching, their conversations dying to whispers. Sullivan waited until she was close enough that their conversation wouldn't be overheard. Up close, she could see that his expensive clothes were genuinely worn from work, not just for show. His hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent time in these fields himself. "I understand you're Michael Chen's widow," he said quietly. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm sorry for your loss. Michael was a good man. I worked with him briefly on some consulting projects." The lie came so smoothly that Emma almost believed it herself. But she had spent the night reading her husband's files, and nowhere in his meticulous documentation had he mentioned any legitimate consulting work with Sullivan Orchards. "Thank you," she managed. "He never mentioned working with you." Sullivan's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm but not quite reaching his eyes. "It was a small project, nothing that would have come up in casual conversation. But when I saw your name on the application list, I wanted to make sure you knew that you have my personal attention. We take care of family here." The word family carried in weight that made Emma's skin crawl. She thought about the workers living in substandard housing while federal money disappeared into private accounts. She thought about pesticide exposure and safety violations and her husband's carefully documented evidence of systematic exploitation. I appreciate that, Mr. Sullivan. I just need honest work. Of course, Rosa Martinez is one of our most experienced crew leaders. She'll take good care of you. He paused, his eyes dropping briefly to her belly. Though I have to say, I'm surprised to see someone in your condition seeking field work. Wouldn't office work be more appropriate? I don't have experience with office work, Emma said, which was true enough. Her background was in elementary education, but she'd left teaching when she married Michael and moved to Portland. Sullivan seemed to consider this. Well, we'll start you on light duty, as Dr. Mitchell recommended. But Emma, may I call you Emma? I want you to know that my door is always open if you need anything. Anything at all. There was something in his tone that made the offer sound less like generosity and more like surveillance. Emma thanked him and returned to Rosa's group, acutely aware that Sullivan's gaze followed her across the field. What did he want? Rosa asked under her breath as they collected their picking buckets and moved toward the trees. To tell me that he knew my husband. Said they worked together on consulting projects. Rosa's expression darkened. Your husband never consulted for Sullivan Orchards. He investigated them. The work began in earnest as the sun climbed higher. Emma's assignment was to sort through picked apples, removing any with damage or disease. It was tedious work that paid less than picking, but it allowed her to stay on the ground and observe the operation around her. The orchard stretched for hundreds of acres, with workers spread throughout the trees like industrious ants. Emma watched the pickers work with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and quick. Many of them had been doing this for years, following the harvest circuit from farm to farm as the seasons changed. What struck her most was the contrast between the workers' conditions and the obvious prosperity of the operation. The picking equipment was old and sometimes dangerous, with ladders that wobbled and safety harnesses that showed signs of serious wear. Yet the processing facilities were state-of-the-art, with expensive machinery and computer systems that tracked every aspect of production. During her lunch break, Emma sat with Rosa and Maria under the shade of an ancient oak tree that predated the orchard. Other workers clustered in small groups, their conversations mixing Spanish and English in the comfortable way of people who had worked together for years. How long have you been working here? Emma asked Maria. 12 years. Maria replied, unwrapping a sandwich from foil. Started when my youngest was in elementary school. The pay was better then, before Blackwell Agricultural bought out the original owner. What changed when Blackwell took over? Rosa and Maria exchanged one of their meaningful looks. Everything, Rosa said simply. The old owner, Patterson, he was fair. Not generous, but fair. Workers had decent housing, regular breaks, safety equipment that actually worked. And now we have fancy new processing equipment and broken ladders, Maria said bitterly. Management talks about efficiency and profit margins. They bring in consultants to study how to get more work out of fewer people. Emma's pulse quickened. What kind of consultants? All kinds. Time and motion experts, agricultural specialists, financial advisors. Rosa's voice trailed off as she realized what she had said. Financial advisors like my husband? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Maria spoke. Emma, your husband wasn't brought in to help the company. He was brought in by someone else, someone who was concerned about what was happening to the workers. Who? Who hired him? Before either woman could answer, a shadow fell across their small group. Emma looked up to see a man in his 50s approaching, his expensive suit looking out of place among the work clothes and flannel shirts. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to doubt his place in the world. Good afternoon, ladies, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Emma couldn't place. Mind if I join you for a moment? Rosa stood immediately, her body language shifting to defensive. Mr. Blackwell, we were just finishing our lunch. Marcus Blackwell. Emma had read his name dozens of times in Michael's files, but seeing him in person was different. He radiated the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. Please sit, he said to Rosa, then turned his attention to Emma. You must be Mrs. Chun. I heard you joined our team. Emma remained seated, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Yes, sir. Excellent. It's always good to have new people who appreciate the value of honest work. His smile was perfectly polished, like everything else about him. I understand you've had some recent difficulties. The loss of a spouse is never easy, especially when there are financial complications. The casual mention of her financial situation sent a chill through Emma. How much did he know about her circumstances? Had he been investigating her the same way she was investigating him? I'm managing, she said carefully. Of course you are. You strike me as a very capable woman. Your husband certainly was a capable man. Very thorough in his work, very persistent in pursuing his projects. The emphasis on persistent carried a subtle threat that made Rosa shift uncomfortably beside Emma. This was not a casual conversation. Blackwell had sought her out deliberately, and he was sending a message. Michael was dedicated to his work, Emma said, matching his casual tone. Indeed, sometimes dedication can lead people into areas where they're not entirely welcome, if you understand my meaning. Not everyone appreciates outside scrutiny of their business practices. Emma's training as a teacher had taught her to recognize bullying in all its forms, and Marcus Blackwell was a master of the art. He was threatening her while maintaining perfect deniability, his words chosen to seem reasonable to any casual observer. I'm just here to work, Mr. Blackwell. I don't know anything about business practices. I'm sure that's true, and I want to make certain it stays that way. He paused, letting the threat settle. We take very good care of our employees here, Mrs. Chun, as long as they focus on their jobs and don't get distracted by outside interests. I understand. Excellent. Blackwell's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. I'm glad we could have this conversation. I think we understand each other perfectly. He walked away without another word, leaving Emma feeling as if she'd just been marked by a predator. Rosa and Maria sat in stunned silence until he was well out of earshot. Dios mío, Maria whispered. He knows. Knows what? Emma asked, though she suspected the answer. That you're not just here for work, Rosa said grimly. That you're connected to your husband's investigation somehow. Emma's mind raced. If Blackwell knew about Michael's investigation, if he suspected that she might continue her husband's work, then she was in immediate danger. But she was also 7 months pregnant with nowhere else to go and no money to run, even if she wanted to. What should I do? Be very, very careful, Rosa said, and trust no one except us. The afternoon passed in a haze of anxiety and forced normalcy. Emma sorted apples and watched the workers around her, trying to see the operation through her husband's eyes. She noticed things she had missed in the morning, the way certain supervisors seemed to be watching specific workers, the subtle segregation that kept different groups separated, the worn-out safety equipment that violated federal regulations. As the workday wound down, Emma found herself assigned to help load the day's harvest into transport trucks. The work was harder than sorting, requiring her to lift and carry buckets of apples to the loading dock. Her back ached, and the baby protested the increased activity with sharp kicks. She was struggling with a particularly heavy bucket when strong hands took it from her. Emma looked up to see David Sullivan himself, his sleeves rolled up and his expensive shirt now genuinely dirty from work. You shouldn't be lifting anything that heavy, he said, his concern seeming genuine. I can manage. I'm sure you can, but there's no point in taking unnecessary risks. He carried the bucket to the truck with easy strength, then returned to where she stood. Emma, can I ask you something personal? Every instinct told her to deflect, to maintain her cover as a desperate widow seeking work. But something in his tone made her pause. What do you want to know? Why are you really here? And please don't tell me it's just about the job. Someone with your education could find work that pays better and doesn't require manual labor. Emma felt a moment of panic. How did he know about her education? She had been careful not to mention her teaching background on her application. I don't know what you mean. Sullivan studied her face for a long moment. Your husband spent a lot of time asking questions about this place before he died. Questions that made certain people very nervous. Now you show up, obviously intelligent, obviously capable of much more than apple sorting, and I have to wonder if you're here to finish what he started. The directness of his question caught Emma completely off guard. She had expected continued threats and veiled warnings, not this apparent honesty. Are you going to fire me? That depends on your answer. Emma looked around the loading dock, acutely aware that they were surrounded by other workers and supervisors. This conversation could be overheard, could be reported back to Blackwell. But something in Sullivan's expression suggested that he was taking the same risk she was. "My husband never told me about any investigation," she said carefully. "But I found his files after he died. I know what he discovered about this place." Sullivan nodded slowly. "And what do you plan to do with that information?" "I don't know yet. I'm 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go and no money. I can't exactly march into the Department of Labor and demand justice." "But you want to, wouldn't you? If someone killed your spouse to cover up a conspiracy?" The words hung between them in the late afternoon air. Sullivan's expression shifted, something like relief crossing his features. "So you do think he was murdered, don't you?" Instead of answering directly, Sullivan glanced around to make sure they weren't being observed. "There's something you need to know about me, Emma. Something that might change how you see this whole situation." "What?" "I'm not who you think I am." Before Emma could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Marcus Blackwell was walking toward them across the loading dock, his face set in lines of barely controlled anger. "David," he called out, his voice carrying an edge that made nearby workers stop their conversations. "I need to speak with you. Now." Sullivan straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. The apparent openness disappeared, replaced by the careful neutrality of someone walking into a confrontation. "Of course, Marcus." "Emma, thank you for your hard work today. Please make sure to ice that back when you get home." The casual dismissal felt like a slap, but Emma recognized it for what it was: protection. Whatever Sullivan had been about to tell her would have to wait. She gathered her things and joined the stream of workers heading toward the parking area, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important. As she reached Rosa's truck, she looked back toward the loading dock. Sullivan and Blackwell stood facing each other, their body language suggesting an argument barely held in check. Even from a distance, she could see the tension between them, the careful positioning of two men who didn't trust each other. "What was that about?" Rosa asked as Emma climbed into the passenger seat. "I'm not sure. Sullivan was asking me about Michael's investigation. But then Blackwell showed up, and you realized you're caught between two very dangerous men," Rosa finished. As they drove away from the orchards, Emma thought about Sullivan's words. "I'm not who you think I am." What had he meant? Was he another investigator, working undercover? Was he a whistleblower trying to expose Blackwell's crimes? Or was he simply a more sophisticated predator, using apparent honesty to gain her trust? The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if reminding her that she was carrying more than just questions and suspicions. She was carrying the future, Michael's child, and possibly the key to exposing a conspiracy that had already claimed at least one life. Tomorrow she would return to the orchards, would continue sorting apples and watching and listening. But tonight, she would study her husband's files again, looking for any clue about David Sullivan's true role in this dangerous game. Because whatever Sullivan was hiding, whatever Blackwell was planning, Emma Chun was determined to survive long enough to ensure that her child inherited truth along with life. The apple orchards disappeared behind them as Rosa's truck wound through the valley roads, but Emma could still feel their presence like a weight on her shoulders. Somewhere in those perfectly ordered rows of trees, secrets grew alongside the fruit, and tomorrow she would return to harvest both. That evening, Emma sat cross-legged on the motel bed, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees as she sifted through Michael's files with new purpose. The conversation with David Sullivan had left her with more questions than answers, and she was determined to find some trace of his involvement in her husband's investigation. She started with Michael's contact lists, scanning through hundreds of names and phone numbers. Most were clients, colleagues, or professional contacts she recognized. But buried in a folder labeled Research Sources, she found something that made her pause: a series of coded entries that didn't match Michael's usual meticulous record-keeping style. The entries were simple, initials followed by numbers and brief descriptive phrases. DS 1847, Insider Concerns. DS 2203, Safety Documentation. DS 0156, Financial Irregularities Confirmed. DS David Sullivan. Emma's pulse quickened as she scrolled through more entries. There were dozens of them, spanning several months leading up to Michael's death. Her husband had been in regular contact with someone using those initials, someone who had been providing inside information about the very crimes Michael was investigating. She opened Michael's phone records, which she had requested from the cell company after his death. Most of the numbers were familiar, but there was one that appeared repeatedly in the weeks before the accident, always late at night, usually, lasting less than 5 minutes. She cross-referenced the number with the coded entries and found a match. David Sullivan had been Michael's inside source. Emma closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling, her mind reeling. If Sullivan had been working with Michael, then his appearance at the orchard wasn't coincidence. It was continuation. But why hadn't he identified himself immediately? Why the elaborate charade of being surprised by her presence? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman she didn't recognize, Hispanic, probably in her early 20s, wearing the kind of clothes that marked her as another orchard worker. Yes, Emma called through the door. My name is Isabella Santos. Rosa Martinez sent me. She said you might need to hear what I have to say. Emma opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain engaged. The young woman looked nervous, her eyes darting around the parking lot as if checking for observers. What do you want to tell me? Not here. Too many eyes. There's a diner about 5 miles north on Highway 47. Mel's Place. Can you meet me there in an hour? Why should I trust you? Isabella's expression grew desperate. Because I know what happened to your husband. And because if we don't do something soon, more people are going to die. An hour later, Emma sat in a corner booth at Mel's Place, a roadside diner that had seen better decades. The lighting was dim, the coffee was strong, and the handful of customers seemed more interested in their meals than in eavesdropping on conversations. Isabella arrived exactly on time, sliding into the booth across from Emma with the quick, nervous movements of someone accustomed to looking over her shoulder. Up close, Emma could see that she was even younger than she had first appeared, probably no more than 22, with old eyes that had seen too much. Thank you for coming, Isabella said quietly. I wasn't sure you would. Rosa said you had information about my husband. I do. But first, you need to understand who I am and why I'm taking this risk. Isabella wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. I work in the main office at Sullivan Orchards. I'm Marcus Blackwell's personal assistant. Emma's breath caught. You work for Blackwell? I worked my way up from the fields over the past 4 years. Blackwell hired me for the office because I'm bilingual and I understand the workers. What he doesn't know is that I've been documenting everything I see. Why? Isabella's expression hardened. Because my brother died in an accident at one of Blackwell's other facilities 2 years ago. Equipment failure, they said. Faulty. Safety harness. But I know the truth. Blackwell had cut the budget for safety equipment maintenance, and my brother paid the price. Emma felt a chill of recognition. Another accident. Another death that served Blackwell's interests. What? Does this have to do with Michael? Your husband contacted me about 6 months ago. He said he was investigating Blackwell Agricultural Holdings on behalf of a federal agency, and he needed inside documentation of safety violations and financial irregularities. What agency? Isabella shook her head. He wouldn't tell me. Said it was better if I didn't know. But he showed me credentials that looked official, and he knew things about the company that only an insider or a federal investigator would know. Emma thought about her husband's files, his carefully documented evidence. What kind of information did you give him? Everything I could get my hands on. Payroll records showing how little workers were actually paid versus what Blackwell claimed to pay them. Safety inspection reports that had been falsified. Financial documents showing where the federal grant money really went. And then, Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper. Then your husband stopped contacting me. I heard about the accident a week later. That's when I realized that Blackwell had figured out what was happening. How could he have known? Because 3 days before your husband died, Blackwell called me into his office. He was different, angry, suspicious. He asked me about my computer usage, about my access to company files. He said there had been a security breach and that he was conducting an internal investigation. Emma felt sick. He knew someone was feeding information to Michael. Worse than that, he knew it was me. Isabella pulled out her phone and showed Emma a text message. This came yesterday, after word got around that you'd been hired. The message was brief but chilling. Keep your mouth shut about the past, or you'll join your brother. Emma stared at the screen, understanding the full scope of the danger they were all in. Why are you telling me this? Why risk it? Because Blackwell thinks he's won. He thinks with your husband dead and the federal investigation buried, he's safe. But he doesn't know about the evidence your husband gathered, and he doesn't know that you found it. What evidence? I have his research files, but no, Isabella interrupted. The real evidence. The original documents I copied for him. Your husband said he was keeping them in a safe place until the federal agents were ready to move. Emma's mind raced. She had been through all of Michael's files, his safe deposit box, even his office at work. Where could he have hidden additional evidence? Did he ever tell you where this safe place was? Not directly, but he mentioned once that he trusted his insurance policy more than he trusted people. Isabella paused, studying Emma's face. Does that mean anything to you? Insurance policy. Michael had been obsessive about their life insurance, constantly updating it and making sure all the documentation was perfect. But Emma had already dealt with the insurance company, had been told about the technicality that voided their claim. Unless that wasn't what Michael had meant. I need to make some phone calls, Emma said suddenly. Can you stay in touch? Can you let me know if Blackwell does anything suspicious? Isabella nodded. I have a secure phone number. But Emma, you need to be careful. If Blackwell suspects that you're continuing your husband's work. I know, but I can't just let this go. Too many people have been hurt. After Isabella left, Emma sat alone in the diner, her mind working through possibilities. Michael had hidden additional evidence somewhere, and he had described it as his insurance policy. The phrase was odd for someone who dealt with actual insurance policies professionally. She paid her bill and drove back to the motel, where she immediately called Michael's insurance agent. The conversation was brief and frustrating. The agent confirmed what she already knew about the denied claim and couldn't provide any additional information. But as she hung up, another possibility occurred to her. Michael had always been precise. In his language, if he had said he trusted his insurance policy more than people, maybe he hadn't been talking about life insurance at all. Emma opened her laptop and searched through Michael's email accounts for any references to insurance. Most were routine communications with their agent, but buried in his work email, she found something interesting: correspondence with a company called Secure Document Services. The emails were brief and businesslike, discussing the rental of a private document storage facility. Michael had rented a secure storage unit 3 weeks before his death, paying for a full year in advance. The rental agreement was in his name only, with specific instructions that only he or his designated heir could access the unit. His designated heir. Emma's pulse quickened as she read the details. Michael had listed her as the only person authorized to access the storage unit in the event of his death, and he had provided the company with her social security number and driver's license information. The storage facility was located in Portland, about 2 hours away. Emma looked at the clock. Was already past 9 p.m., too late to drive there tonight. But tomorrow was Saturday, and she didn't have to work at the orchard. She could drive to Portland, access the storage unit, and finally see what evidence Michael had considered important enough to hide. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with low clouds hanging over the valley like a blanket. Emma left the motel early, before the orchard workers began their Saturday shifts. She had left a message for Rosa explaining that she had a personal emergency and wouldn't be working that day. The drive to Portland gave her time to think, to process everything she had learned in the past few days. Michael had been working with both David Sullivan and Isabella Santos, gathering evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Sullivan Orchards. He had been close to exposing the truth when someone, almost certainly Marcus Blackwell, had arranged his death. Now she was continuing his work, carrying his child and his evidence toward what she hoped would be justice. But she was also walking deeper into the same danger that had killed him. The Secure Document Services facility was located in an industrial area of Portland, surrounded by warehouses and shipping companies. The building was modern and nondescript, with high-tech security systems and armed guards. Emma presented her identification and the documentation Michael had provided, then followed a security escort to a small, windowless room. The storage unit contained a single filing cabinet and a laptop computer. Emma's hands shook as she opened the first drawer and saw Michael's familiar handwriting on dozens of file folders. Each folder was labeled with dates and locations, not just Sullivan Orchards, but facilities throughout Oregon and Washington. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Blackwell Agricultural Holdings operated more than 30 facilities across the Pacific Northwest, and according to Michael's research, they were systematically defrauding the federal government while exploiting thousands of workers. The laptop contained digital copies of the documents Isabella had provided, along with audio recordings of phone conversations and video footage taken with hidden cameras. Michael had been building an airtight case, one that would have resulted in federal criminal charges and the shutdown of Blackwell's entire operation. But it was the final folder that made Emma's blood run cold. It contained correspondence between Michael and a contact at the Department of Labor, confirming that a federal task force was being assembled to investigate Blackwell Agricultural Holdings. The investigation was scheduled to begin the week after Michael's death. Instead, according to the final document in the folder, the investigation had been canceled due to insufficient evidence and concerns about source reliability. Someone with significant power had buried the federal investigation. Someone who had known about Michael's evidence and had acted to discredit it before it could be used. Emma copied everything onto a flash drive and took photographs of the most important documents with her phone. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a sealed envelope taped to the inside of the filing cabinet. Her name was written on it in Michael's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated 3 days before his death. Emma, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I need you to know that I love you and our child more than life itself, and that everything I've done has been to build a better world for both of you. The evidence in this storage unit represents months of work by myself and several brave individuals who risked everything to expose the truth. Marcus Blackwell and his associates have built an empire on the exploitation of vulnerable people, and they have shown that they will kill to protect their interests. I believe I am in immediate danger. My investigation has progressed to the point where federal action is imminent, and Blackwell knows that his organization is about to be exposed. I have taken precautions to protect the evidence and to ensure that justice will be served even if something happens to me. David Sullivan, who owns Sullivan Orchards, has been working undercover for the past year as part of the federal investigation. He is not the man he appears to be. His real name is Agent David Sutherland, and he works for the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General. He has been my primary contact with the federal task force. If something happens to me, find Agent Sutherland. Show him this letter and tell him about the evidence in this storage unit. He will know what to do. I know this is a terrible burden to place on you, especially now when you should be focused on preparing for our child's birth. But I also know that you have the strength and the courage to see this through. You are the best person I have ever known, and I trust you to finish what I started. Take care of yourself and our baby. Make sure our child grows up in a world where justice matters more than profit. All my love, Michael. Emma read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. David Sullivan was a federal agent, working undercover. His apparent ownership of the orchard was part of an elaborate investigation that had been ongoing for more than a year. But if Michael's letter was true, then why had the federal investigation been canceled? Why was Sullivan still maintaining his cover? And why hadn't he identified himself to her immediately? As Emma drove back toward Millbrook Valley, she wrestled with these questions. The simplest explanation was that the investigation was still ongoing, that the cancellation had been a cover story to protect Sullivan's identity. But that didn't explain why he hadn't told her the truth when she had revealed her knowledge of Michael's work. Unless he didn't trust her, unless he suspected that she might be working with Blackwell, or that she might inadvertently compromise his investigation. The thought stung, but Emma had to admit it made sense from an operational standpoint. She was an unknown quantity, showing up at the orchard with a convenient cover story and suspicious timing. An experienced federal agent would naturally be cautious about trusting her. But now she had proof of his real identity and his connection to Michael. The question was what to do with that information. As she approached Millbrook Valley, Emma made a decision. She would return to work on Monday, as if nothing had changed. She would continue her role as a desperate widow seeking employment. But she would also find a way to communicate with Agent Sutherland privately, to show him Michael's letter and the evidence her husband had died to protect. Because somewhere in those apple orchards, a federal investigation was still ongoing. And Emma Chun was determined to ensure that her husband's sacrifice would not be in vain. The baby kicked as she pulled into the motel parking lot, as if approving of her decision. Tomorrow was Sunday, a day of rest. But Monday would bring new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps finally, the beginning of justice for Michael and all the other victims of Marcus Blackwell's greed. Emma locked the flash drive in the motel safe and settled down to study the evidence her husband had died to gather. She had work to do. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that penetrated Emma's jacket as she stood once again at the edge of the North Fields. She had spent most of Sunday memorizing the details in Michael's letter and planning how to approach Agent Sutherland without compromising his investigation or her own safety. The challenge was that she couldn't be certain who else might be watching. If Blackwell suspected that federal agents were operating in his organization, he would have people monitoring communications and interactions between employees. A careless word or gesture could expose Sutherland's identity, and in the investigation before justice could be served. Rosa approached her with the usual thermos of coffee, but Emma could see worry etched in the older woman's features. "You look tired, Mija. How was your weekend?" "Complicated," Emma admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "I learned some things about my husband's work that I'm still trying to process. Good things or dangerous things?" "Both." Before Rosa could respond, the familiar sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the access road. Instead of the usual convoy of supervisors' trucks, a single black SUV was making its way toward the fields. Emma recognized it immediately as the type of vehicle that government agencies preferred, expensive enough to blend in with executive transportation, but equipped with communication gear and other specialized equipment. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that penetrated Emma's jacket as she stood once again at the edge of the North Fields. She had spent most of Sunday memorizing the details in Michael's letter and planning how to approach Agent Sutherland without compromising his investigation or her own safety. The challenge was that she couldn't be certain who else might be watching. If Blackwell suspected that federal agents were operating in his organization, he would have people monitoring communications and interactions between employees. A careless word or gesture could expose Sutherland's identity, and in the investigation before justice could be served. Rosa approached her with the usual thermos of coffee, but Emma could see worry etched in the older woman's features. "You look tired, Mija. How was your weekend?" "Complicated," Emma admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "I learned some things about my husband's work that I'm still trying to process. Good things or dangerous things?" "Both." Before Rosa could respond, the familiar sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the access road. Instead of the usual convoy of supervisors' trucks, a single black SUV was making its way toward the fields. Emma recognized it immediately as the type of vehicle that government agencies preferred, expensive enough to blend in with executive transportation, but equipped with communication gear and other specialized equipment. The SUV parked near the main office, and Emma watched as two men in business suits emerged. They were clearly not agricultural workers or local officials. Their movements were too controlled, their observation of the surroundings too systematic. These were federal agents, and their presence meant that something significant was happening. "Immigration," Rosa whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Emma shook her head. Immigration raids typically involved multiple vehicles and a show of force designed to intimidate. This was something else entirely, something more subtle and potentially more dangerous. David Sullivan emerged from the main office building and walked toward the SUV. Even from a distance, Emma could see the tension in his posture. The conversation between Sullivan and the two agents was brief, conducted in voices too low to carry across the field. After several minutes, the agents returned to their vehicle and drove away, leaving Sullivan standing alone in the parking area. "That's not good," Maria said, joining their small group. Men in suits showing up unannounced means trouble for somebody. Emma watched Sullivan as he stood motionless for several more moments, apparently lost in thought. When he finally turned toward the fields, his gaze swept across the assembled workers and stopped when it reached her. Even at a distance, she could sense his urgency. "Emma," Rosa said quietly, "whatever you learned this weekend, I think it's about to become very important." The morning work assignment placed Emma back on apple sorting duty, which meant she would be stationed near the loading dock where Sullivan could easily find her if he needed to communicate. As she settled into the familiar rhythm of examining fruit and removing damaged specimens, she kept one eye on the orchard operations around her. Something had changed. The usual easy interaction between workers and supervisors had been replaced by a subtle tension that Emma could feel like electricity in the air. Conversations were quieter, movements more careful. Even the experienced pickers seemed to be working with unusual focus, as if they sensed that they were being watched more closely than usual. Around 10 o'clock, a supervisor approached Emma's sorting station. "Mrs. Chun, Mr. Sullivan wants to see you in his office. Bring your time card." Emma's pulse quickened. The request for her time card suggested official business, but she knew this was likely Sullivan's way of creating a plausible excuse for a private conversation. She followed the supervisor across the facility to a cluster of modular buildings that housed the administrative offices. Sullivan's office was larger than she had expected, with windows overlooking the entire orchard operation. The space was functional rather than luxurious, with agricultural charts on the walls and filing cabinets that looked heavily used. Sullivan sat behind a desk covered with paperwork, but he stood when she entered. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Close the door behind you." Emma did as instructed, noting that Sullivan waited until the door was closed before speaking again. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to talk, and we don't have much time. Those men who were here this morning brought some disturbing news." "What kind of news?" Sullivan studied her face for a long moment, as if making a final assessment of her trustworthiness. "The kind that suggests your husband's death wasn't the end of this investigation, just a temporary setback." Emma felt her heart skip. "You know about Michael's investigation?" "I know a lot more than that." Sullivan opened his desk drawer and removed a small device that looked like a radio scanner. He switched it on, and it immediately began emitting a low humming sound. "Audio countermeasures," he explained. "We can speak freely now." The confirmation that Sullivan was indeed operating with sophisticated surveillance equipment removed Emma's last doubts about his real identity. This was Agent David Sutherland, exactly as Michael had described in his letter. "I found Michael's storage unit," she said quietly. "I read his letter. I know who you really are." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Emma noticed a slight relaxation in his shoulders. "Good. That saves us some time we don't have. What else did you find in that storage unit?" "Everything. Financial records, audio recordings, video evidence. Enough to destroy Blackwell's entire operation and send him to prison for the rest of his life." "Did you bring any of it with you?" Emma shook her head. "I made copies, but I left them in a secure location. I wasn't sure if I could trust you. Yet." "Smart. Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Emma, the men who were here this morning weren't just checking on the investigation. They were warning me that our operation has been compromised." "Compromised how?" "Someone with significant influence has been working to shut down our investigation from the inside. The federal task force that was supposed to move against Blackwell has been disbanded, and several key witnesses have either disappeared or recanted their testimony." Emma felt a chill of recognition. "Like Isabella Santos?" Sullivan's eyes sharpened. "You know Isabella? She contacted me Saturday night. She's been feeding information to Blackwell's people about the investigation." "Not willingly," Emma added. Quickly. "She's being threatened. We suspected as much. Isabella stopped responding to our communications about 2 weeks ago. We assumed Blackwell had either bought her off or intimidated her into silence." "It's intimidation. She showed me a text message threatening her life if she talked." Sullivan nodded grimly. "That fits the pattern. Blackwell has been systematically eliminating anyone who could testify against him. Your husband's death was just the beginning." "How many others?" 3 confirmed, 2 more missing. All of them were scheduled to testify before the federal grand jury that was supposed to convene last month. Emma felt sick. "And the investigation? Officially? Suspended pending further evidence. Unofficially? My superiors are under pressure from someone very high up in the federal government to drop the case entirely. Someone Blackwell bought, or someone who has their own reasons for protecting his operation. Agriculture is a big business, Emma. Blackwell Agricultural Holdings provides food to military bases, federal facilities, even the Capitol building cafeteria. He has contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars and friends in very powerful places." Emma absorbed this information, understanding for the first time the full scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about worker exploitation at a single orchard. It was about a systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. So what do? We follow your husband's backup plan. What backup plan? Sullivan reached into his filing cabinet and withdrew a folder that Emma recognized immediately. It contained copies of the same documents she had found in Michael's storage unit, along with additional materials she hadn't seen. Michael knew that the federal investigation might be compromised. He also knew that Blackwell had enough political influence to bury a case if it stayed within normal channels. So he developed an alternative strategy. Emma opened the folder and found herself looking at correspondence between Michael and several investigative journalists, along with draft press releases and media contacts. He was going to expose the story publicly. Not just publicly, simultaneously. Michael had arranged for coordinated releases through multiple news outlets, making it impossible for Blackwell's people to suppress the story through normal political channels. But he died before he could implement the plan. Yes, but the framework is still in place. The journalists are still interested, and the evidence is still compelling. We just need someone to activate the plan. Emma looked up from the documents. You want me to do it? I want us to do it. But Emma, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. Once this story goes public, there will be no going back. Blackwell will use every resource at his disposal to discredit the evidence and eliminate the people responsible for exposing him. He's already trying to eliminate me. At least this way, his crimes will be exposed before he succeeds. Sullivan studied her face, perhaps seeing something of Michael's determination reflected there. There's something else you need to know. The federal agents who visited this morning weren't just warning me about the compromised investigation. They were telling me that my cover has been blown. Emma's breath caught. Blackwell knows who you are? He suspects. Which means that very soon, my effectiveness as an undercover agent will be over. This may be our last chance to gather additional evidence from inside his operation. What kind of additional evidence? Isabella mentioned financial records that she couldn't access from her workstation. Records that would show exactly where the federal grant money went and who authorized the diversions. If we could get our hands on those documents. Where are they? Blackwell's private office. In the main administration building. It's a secured area that requires executive-level access to enter. Emma understood immediately. You want to break in? I want to retrieve evidence that will ensure justice for your husband and all the other victims of this conspiracy. But I can't do it alone, and I can't involve any other federal agents without risking the entire operation. The baby kicked hard against Emma's ribs, as if reminding her of the stakes involved. She was 7 months pregnant, exhausted from stress and physical labor, and being asked to participate in what amounted to a burglary of a federal contractor's secured facility. But she was also Michael Chen's widow, carrying his child in his evidence toward the justice he had died trying to achieve. What would you need me to do? Create a distraction. Something that would draw security attention away from the administration building long enough for me to access Blackwell's office. What kind of distraction? Sullivan hesitated. Something involving your condition. If you were to have a medical emergency during working hours, it would require immediate attention from all supervisory personnel. Emergency services would be called, and security would be focused on managing the situation rather than monitoring access points. Emma felt a chill as she understood what he was suggesting. You want me to fake going into labor? Not fake. Induce. There are natural methods that can trigger early labor contractions. Nothing dangerous to you or the baby, but convincing. Enough to create the chaos we need. And if something goes wrong, if the contractions don't stop, you'd be taken to the hospital, where you'd receive excellent medical care. Your baby would be born healthy, just a few weeks early. Many babies are born at 36 weeks with no complications. Emma placed her hands on her belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of her unborn child. The baby was healthy and active, probably large enough to survive an early delivery. But the thought of deliberately triggering labor filled her with terror. When would this need to happen? Tonight. Blackwell is scheduled to attend a conference in Seattle tomorrow, which means his office will be empty and his security detail will be reduced. If we're going to do this, it has to be tonight. Emma closed her eyes, thinking about Michael's letter, about his belief that she had the strength and courage to finish what he had started. She thought about Rosa and Maria and Isabella and all the other workers who had suffered under Blackwell's exploitation. She thought about the federal agents who had died or disappeared trying to expose the truth. Most of all, she thought about the child she carried, Michael's child, who deserved to grow up in a world where justice mattered more than profit. What do I need to do? Sullivan's expression mixed relief with concern. There are herbs that can stimulate contractions. I can get them from a traditional medicine practitioner I know. You would take them around 6 p.m. during the evening shift change when there are maximum number of people around to witness your condition. And then you let nature take its course. The contractions will begin within an hour or two. When they become intense enough, you call for help. Emergency services will respond, supervisors will gather, and security attention will be focused on getting you medical care. How long would you need? 20 minutes inside Blackwell's office should be enough to photograph the documents we need. Once I have them, we can trigger the media releases and let the story expose itself. Emma nodded slowly. And after that, you go to the hospital and have your baby. Blackwell goes to prison. The workers get justice. And your husband's sacrifice finally means something. The baby kicked again, softer this time, as if settling into acceptance of the plan. Emma looked at Sullivan, Agent Sutherland, and saw in his eyes the same determination that had driven Michael to risk everything for the truth. I'll do it. Emma, you need to understand. I understand. I understand that my husband died for this. I understand that other people have died for this. I understand that if we don't act now, Blackwell will escape justice and continue destroying lives. She stood up, her decision made. What kind of herbs do I need? Sullivan wrote down an address on a piece of paper. There's a traditional medicine shop about 15 miles from here. The owner is discreet and knowledgeable. Tell him you need something to ease the transition into labor for a woman at 36 weeks gestation. He'll know what to give you. And tonight, report for your usual evening shift. Work normally until the herbs take effect. When the contractions begin, don't try to hide them. Let people see that you're in distress. The more dramatic the situation appears, the more effectively it will serve our purposes. Emma took the address and prepared to leave. As she reached for the door handle, Sullivan called her name. Emma, what you're doing takes incredible courage. Michael would be proud of you. She turned back to face him. Michael is dead because he tried to do the right thing. I'm not being courageous. I'm being practical. This is the only way to ensure his death wasn't meaningless. Still, I want you to know that if anything goes wrong tonight, if the plan fails, or if you change your mind, no one will blame you. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Emma smiled sadly. Agent Sutherland, I've been carrying Michael's child for 7 months. I've been carrying his evidence for 3 days. Tonight, I'm going to deliver both of them into the world, one way or another. She left Sullivan's office and returned to her sorting station, where Rosa was waiting with obvious concern. What did you want? To discuss my work performance, Emma said, which was true in a broader sense. Rosa, I need to ask you something. If something happens to me tonight, if there's a medical emergency, will you make sure I get to a good hospital? Rosa's eyes widened with alarm. Emma, what are you planning? Nothing dangerous. But my baby might decide to come a little early, and I want to make sure someone is looking out for me if that happens. Of course, Mija. But why tonight? Are you feeling contractions? Not yet, Emma said truthfully. But sometimes babies have their own timing. The rest of the workday passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. Emma sorted apples and watched the clock, her mind cycling through the plan and its potential complications. Every few minutes, the baby would move or kick, reminding her that she was about to deliberately trigger the most significant event in both their lives. At 4 p.m., she drove to the traditional medicine shop Sullivan had recommended. The owner was an elderly Asian man who spoke softly and asked careful questions about her condition. When she explained that she was hoping to encourage the natural onset of labor for a baby at 36 weeks, he nodded understanding and prepared a mixture of herbs with precise, practiced movements. Take this with warm water at 6 o'clock. He instructed. Contractions should begin within 2 hours. If they become too intense, or if you experience any complications, go to hospital immediately. How strong will the contractions be? Strong enough to convince anyone watching that you are in active labor, but not so strong as to cause harm to you or baby. This mixture has been used safely for hundreds of years. Emma paid for the herbs and returned to the orchard for the evening shift. As she changed into her work clothes, She tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the positive outcome they were working toward. By tomorrow morning, Blackwell's crimes would be exposed to the world. Michael's death would finally have meaning. Justice would be served. At 6 o'clock precisely, Emma dissolved the herbs in warm water and drank the bitter mixture. Then she reported to her evening workstation and waited for her body to respond to the ancient medicine now coursing through her system. The wait was about to end, and the most dangerous part of their plan was about to begin. The first contraction hit Emma at exactly 7:43 p.m., just as the traditional medicine practitioner had predicted. She was sorting the day's final harvest when a wave of cramping swept across her lower abdomen, strong enough to make her gasp and grip the edge of the sorting table for support. Rosa, working at the adjacent station, immediately noticed her distress. "Emma, what's wrong?" "I think." Emma let her voice trail off as she pressed her hands against her belly, not needing to fake the discomfort she was experiencing. The herbal mixture was working exactly as intended, triggering genuine contractions that her body interpreted as the beginning of labor. "Is it the baby?" Maria asked, abandoning her own work to move closer. Emma nodded, allowing genuine concern to show on her face. The contractions were manageable at this point, but she could feel them building in intensity with each wave. "I think it's starting." Word spread quickly through the evening shift workers. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered around Emma's workstation, their voices mixing concern with excitement. Someone had already gone to fetch a supervisor, and Emma could see a figure in a company polo shirt jogging toward them across the orchard floor. The supervisor was a young man Emma hadn't met before, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was his first experience dealing with a pregnant employee in labor. He arrived slightly out of breath and immediately began pulling out his cell phone. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked, his voice higher than he probably intended. "Maybe 5 minutes," Emma said, which was close to accurate. The herbal mixture was working with remarkable precision, triggering contractions at regular intervals that mimicked the early stages of natural labor. "We need to call an ambulance," the supervisor said, already dialing. "And I should notify Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Blackwell." "Perfect." Emma allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she realized the plan was proceeding exactly as Agent Sutherland had hoped. Within minutes, every member of management would be focused on her medical emergency, leaving the administrative building unguarded. Another contraction struck, stronger than the first, and this time Emma didn't need to exaggerate her response. She doubled over slightly, breathing hard as the wave of cramping peaked and then subsided. Rosa immediately moved to support her, one arm around her shoulders. "Breathe, Mija," Rosa said softly. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." The supervisor finished his call and turned back to the group. "Ambulance is on the way. Should be here in about 15 minutes. Is there anything we can do to make her more comfortable?" "We should get her sitting down," Maria suggested. "And maybe some water." As the women helped Emma toward a nearby bench, she caught sight of Agent Sutherland emerging from the main office building. Even from a distance, she could see the controlled urgency in his movements as he approached the crowd. He was playing his role perfectly, displaying exactly the level of concern that would be expected from a responsible employer dealing with a medical emergency. "What's the situation?" he asked the supervisor as he reached the group. "Mrs. Chen appears to be going into labor. Contractions are about 5 minutes apart. I've called for an ambulance." Sutherland knelt beside the bench where Emma was sitting, his expression professionally concerned. "How are you feeling? Any pain besides the contractions?" "Just the normal labor pain," Emma said, which was becoming increasingly true. The herbal mixture was triggering genuine contractions that were growing stronger with each cycle. "Have you called her emergency contact?" Sutherland asked the supervisor. The question caught everyone off guard. Emma realized she had never filled out emergency contact information on her employment forms, an oversight that now created an awkward moment. "I don't have any emergency contacts," she said quietly. "My husband died 3 months ago." The admission created a brief, sympathetic silence among the gathered workers. Several of them exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting the shared understanding that Emma was facing this crisis alone. "Well, you're not alone now," Rosa said firmly. "We'll make sure you're taken care of." Another contraction struck, This one strong enough to make Emma grip the bench and focus entirely on breathing through the pain. When it passed, she looked up to find Sutherland watching her with what appeared to be genuine concern mixed with something else, approval, perhaps, or respect for her commitment to the mission. "I should call Mr. Blackwell," the supervisor said. "He'll want to know about this." "No need," Sutherland replied smoothly. "Marcus is already dealing with the Seattle conference preparations. I'll handle the situation here and brief him tomorrow." Emma felt a surge of relief. The last thing they needed was Blackwell arriving to personally oversee her emergency. His absence would give Sutherland much more freedom to move around the facility unobserved. The sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of the ambulance. Emma watched as the emergency vehicle navigated the orchard's access roads, its flashing lights creating dramatic patterns against the darkening sky. Several more supervisors had arrived, along with what appeared to be most of the evening shift workers who had abandoned their stations to witness the unfolding drama. The paramedics were efficient and professional, immediately taking charge of the situation with the calm competence that came from years of handling medical emergencies. The lead paramedic was a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Janet and began asking Emma questions about her pregnancy and medical history. "How many weeks are you?" Janet asked as she checked Emma's vital signs. 36 weeks. "And this is your first pregnancy?" "Yes." "Any complications during pregnancy? Gestational diabetes, high blood pressure, anything like that?" "No. Everything's been normal." Janet nodded and made notes on her clipboard. "Well, at 36 weeks, if this is real labor, your baby should be perfectly healthy. We'll transport you to Millbrook General and let the doctors evaluate your progress." As the paramedics prepared the gurney, Emma caught Sutherland's eye. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod, the signal that he was ready to implement his part of the plan. While everyone's attention was focused on her medical emergency, he would slip away to the administrative building and access Blackwell's private office. "Rosa," Emma called out as the paramedics helped her onto the gurney. "Will you come with me? I don't want to be alone." "Of course, Mija," Rosa replied immediately. "I'll ride in the ambulance." The gesture served two purposes. It ensured that Emma would have support during what might actually turn into a real delivery, and it removed Rosa from the orchard before she could accidentally observe Sutherland's covert activities. As the ambulance pulled away from Sullivan Orchards, Emma watched through the rear window as the crowd of workers began to disperse. In the fading daylight, she could just make out Sutherland's figure moving purposefully toward the administrative complex, taking advantage of the chaos her emergency had created. The 20-minute drive to Millbrook General Hospital passed in a blur of continued contractions and medical monitoring. The herbal mixture was proving remarkably effective. The contractions were genuine and increasingly intense, creating all the symptoms of early labor without posing any apparent danger to Emma or her baby. "How are you doing?" Rosa asked, holding Emma's hand as another contraction peaked. "Better than I expected," Emma admitted. The contractions hurt, but not unbearably. Janet, the lead paramedic, was monitoring Emma's vital signs and tracking the frequency of contractions. "Your baby's heartbeat is strong and steady," she reported. "Blood pressure is normal. If this is active labor, everything looks good so far." At the hospital, Emma was quickly transferred to the maternity ward, where a team of nurses and doctors began a thorough evaluation of her condition. Dr. Rosa Martinez, the attending obstetrician, was a calm, competent woman who explained each step of the examination process. "Your cervix is dilated about 3 centimeters," Dr. Martinez reported after the initial examination. "You're definitely in early labor. At 36 weeks, we'll monitor you closely, but there's no immediate cause for concern." "Is the baby okay?" "The baby looks great. Heart rate is perfect, and the movement patterns are normal. Babies born at 36 weeks usually do very well, so even if labor progresses rapidly, your little one should be just fine." Emma felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The plan was working. Her contractions were convincing enough to justify the emergency response, and Agent Sutherland now had the distraction he needed to access Blackwell's office. But she was also committed to seeing this through to the end, which might very well mean giving birth to her child several weeks earlier than planned. "How long will labor take?" she asked. "With first pregnancies, Early labor can last anywhere from 6 to 12 hours, Dr. Martinez explained. We'll keep monitoring your progress and intervene if necessary. Rosa had been allowed to stay in the labor room, and she sat beside Emma's bed providing comfort and encouragement. Around 10 p.m., as the contractions continued their steady rhythm, Rosa's phone buzzed with a text message. "It's from Maria," Rosa said after reading the message. "She says everything is quiet at the orchard. Everyone went home after the ambulance left." Emma nodded, understanding the coded message. Sutherland had completed his mission without detection. Whatever evidence he had been seeking in Blackwell's office was now in the hands of federal investigators. As midnight approached, Dr. Martinez returned to check Emma's progress. "You're now dilated to 6 centimeters," she announced. "Labor is proceeding normally. Your baby should be born sometime in the next few hours." Emma closed her eyes and focused on breathing through another contraction. In a few hours, she would hold Michael's child in her arms. But more importantly, the evidence that would bring down Marcus Blackwell was now secure, and the truth about her husband's death would finally be exposed. The baby kicked strongly against her ribs, as if eager to enter the world and claim the justice that was rightfully theirs. Emma smiled despite the pain, thinking about Michael's letter and his faith in her ability to finish what he had started. She had kept that faith. She had delivered the evidence and triggered the investigation that would finally hold Blackwell accountable for his crimes. Now all that remained was to deliver their child into a world where justice would finally prevail. At 2:37 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Imogen gave birth to a healthy baby girl. As she held her daughter for the first time, she whispered Michael's name and promised that their child would grow up knowing that her father had died a hero. Outside the hospital window, the sun was beginning to rise over Millbrook Valley, painting the apple orchards in shades of gold and hope. Somewhere in those fields, the workers who had befriended Emma were preparing for another day of labor, not yet knowing that their lives were about to change forever. The evidence was secure. The story was ready to break. Justice was finally within reach. And in the maternity ward of Millbrook General Hospital, Michael Chin's daughter opened her eyes to see the world her parents had fought to make better. 3 days after giving birth to her daughter, Emma sat in her hospital bed watching the morning news when her world exploded across every major network simultaneously. The coordinated media release that Michael had planned months earlier was finally being executed, and the scope of the story was even more devastating than she had imagined. Breaking news this morning as federal investigators announced the largest agricultural fraud case in U.S. history, the anchor announced, her voice grave with the weight of the revelations. Blackwell Agricultural Holdings, which operates facilities across the Pacific Northwest, stands accused of systematically defrauding the federal government of over $50 million while exploiting thousands of migrant workers in conditions that investigators describe as modern slavery. Emma held her sleeping daughter closer as images of Sullivan orchards filled the television screen. She recognized the fields where she had worked, the buildings where she had sorted apples, the loading dock where she had first encountered David Sullivan. But now those familiar locations were swarming with federal agents, their official vehicles creating a convoy that stretched from the main office to the worker housing areas. According to federal prosecutors, the anchor continued. The scheme involved falsifying safety inspection reports, diverting federal grant money intended for worker protection programs, and systematically underreporting wages while claiming full compliance with labor protection laws. The investigation was triggered by evidence compiled by Portland financial analyst Michael Chun, who died in what authorities now believe was a targeted assassination. The screen shifted to a photograph of Michael that Emma hadn't seen before, a professional headshot that must have been taken for some corporate publication. Seeing his face on national television, hearing his name spoken as that of a hero rather than an accident victim, brought tears to her eyes. Chun had been working undercover with federal investigators for over 8 months, the reporter explained, gathering evidence that forms the backbone of what prosecutors are calling an airtight case against the agricultural conglomerate and its owner, Marcus Blackwell. Emma's phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke, but she had ignored most of the calls. Rosa and Maria had both left messages expressing their shock and admiration. Isabella Santos had called to say that she was finally ready to testify publicly about her brother's death and Blackwell's threats. Even Dr. Martinez, who had delivered Emma's baby, had stopped by to say that she was proud to have been part of the story. But it was the call from Agent Sutherland that Emma had been waiting for most anxiously. When it finally came, just after noon, his voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that she immediately recognized. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired, sore, but incredibly relieved," Emma replied honestly. "Did you get everything you needed from Blackwell's office?" "More than we hoped for. The financial records you helped us access contained detailed documentation of money transfers, falsified inspection reports, and communications with political contacts who helped bury the original investigation. We have a complete paper trail showing exactly how the conspiracy operated. And Blackwell, arrested this morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport trying to board a flight to Switzerland. Apparently, he had been planning his escape route for some time, but the coordinated media release caught him off guard." Emma felt a surge of satisfaction. What about his political connections? The people who helped cover up the investigation? That's where things get interesting. The evidence we recovered includes communications with a deputy assistant secretary in the Department of Labor who had been feeding Blackwell advance warning about federal investigations. There are also financial records showing payments to a congressional staff member who helped influence agricultural oversight legislation. So it goes all the way to Washington. It goes all the way to Washington. By the time this investigation is complete, we expect to have criminal charges against more than a dozen people, including several federal officials. Emma shifted her daughter to her other arm, marveling at how such a tiny person could sleep so peacefully while the adult world churned with revelations and arrests around her. What happens now? Now we build the case for trial. Blackwell will probably try to negotiate a plea deal, but with the evidence we have, prosecutors are confident they can secure convictions on multiple felony charges. He's looking at decades in prison. And the workers? What happens to them? That's actually the best part of this story. The federal government has already announced a comprehensive review of working conditions at all Blackwell agricultural facilities. Workers who are underpaid will receive back wages plus penalties. The substandard housing will be replaced with facilities that actually meet federal standards. And a victim compensation fund is being established for families of workers who died due to safety violations. Emma closed her eyes, imagining Rosa and Maria and all the other workers finally receiving the justice they deserved. Michael would be so proud. He should be. This case is going to change how agricultural labor is regulated nationwide. Congress is already talking about new legislation to strengthen worker protections and increase penalties for companies that violate federal labor laws. After ending the call with Agent Sutherland, Emma spent the afternoon fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted to tell her story. She agreed to speak with 3 major news outlets, carefully crafting her narrative to honor Michael's memory while protecting the operational details that might compromise future investigations. The interviews were emotionally draining, but also cathartic. For months, Emma had carried the weight of knowing that her husband had been murdered, that his death had been dismissed as an accident by people who should have sought justice. Now the truth was public, and Michael's sacrifice was being recognized for what it truly was. The act of a man who had risked everything to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Martinez stopped by to check on both Emma and the baby. "You've had quite a few days," she observed as she conducted the routine post-delivery examination. "More than I bargained for when I applied for that apple picking job." "About that," Dr. Martinez said with a smile. "The herbs you took to induce labor. That was remarkably sophisticated planning. How did you know they would work so precisely?" Emma had wondered if the medical team would figure out that her labor had been artificially triggered. A friend recommended a traditional medicine practitioner. "I was told the mixture would encourage the natural onset of labor without endangering the baby." Well, whoever prepared that mixture knew exactly what they were doing. Your daughter was born at exactly the right time, early enough to serve your purposes, but late enough to be completely healthy. That evening, as Emma prepared for what she hoped would be her last night in the hospital, she received an unexpected visitor. David Sullivan, she still thought of him by that name rather than his real identity, appeared in her doorway carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing civilian clothes rather than his usual work attire. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said. I wanted to check on you and the baby before things get too complicated with the trial preparations. Of course not. Please, come in. Sutherland approached the bed where Emma's daughter was, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. She's beautiful. Have you chosen a name? Hope Michelle Chun, Emma replied. Hope for the future, Michelle for her father. Perfect. Sutherland studied the sleeping infant for a moment. You know, when I first started this investigation, I never imagined it would lead to a moment like this. A new life entering the world just as we were finally able to expose the truth about so many deaths. Michael always said that the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living. He was a remarkable man. I wish I could have known him better. Emma gestured for Sutherland to take the chair beside her bed. What was he like during the investigation? I know about the evidence he gathered, but I don't know much about how he handled the stress of working undercover. Sutherland settled into the chair, his expression thoughtful. He was nervous at first. Most civilians are when they get involved in federal investigations. But he had this incredible sense of purpose that kept him focused even when things got dangerous. He talked about you and the baby constantly. Everything he did was motivated by his desire to build a better world for his family. Did he know how dangerous it was becoming? Toward the end, yes. He had started taking precautions, varying his routes home, checking his car for tampering, staying in public places whenever possible. He knew Blackwell was getting suspicious, but he was determined to see the investigation through to completion. Emma felt tears stinging her eyes. I keep thinking that if I had known what he was doing, maybe I could have convinced him to be more careful. Emma, what happened to Michael wasn't about being careful or careless. Blackwell had him killed. Because the evidence Michael had gathered was going to destroy everything Blackwell had built. There was nothing you could have done to change that outcome. Except what I did do. Exactly. You finished what he started. You ensured that his death wasn't meaningless. And you did it while carrying his child and facing dangers that would have broken most people. The baby stirred in her bassinet, making the soft sounds that indicated she was beginning to wake up. Emma reached over to stroke her daughter's cheek, marveling again at the perfect features and tiny fingers. What happens now? She asked. With the trial, I mean. Will I need to testify? Probably, though we'll try to minimize your involvement as much as possible. You've been through enough, and you have a newborn to care for. But your testimony about finding Michael's evidence and about Blackwell's threats at the orchard will be important for establishing the full scope of the conspiracy. I'll do whatever is necessary. I know you will. But Emma, I want you to understand that your part in this story is essentially over. You've done what needed to be done. Now it's time for you to focus on being a mother and building a life for yourself and Hope. The baby chose that moment to open her eyes, looking up at the adults with the unfocused but alert gaze of a newborn discovering the world. Emma lifted her daughter from the bassinet, and Hope immediately quieted, seeming to recognize her mother's voice and touch. Hello, sweetheart, Emma whispered. Ready to go home and start our new life? Sutherland watched the interaction with obvious emotion. Michael would be so proud of both of you. I hope so. I hope when she's old enough to understand, Hope will be proud of what her father did. She will be. The changes that will come from this investigation, the improved working conditions, the stronger labor protections, the accountability for companies that exploit workers, all of that will be part of Michael's legacy. The next morning, Emma was discharged from the hospital with a healthy baby and a future that looked dramatically different from what she had imagined just a week earlier. The life insurance company, faced with public evidence that Michael had been murdered, had reversed their decision and paid out the full policy amount. Federal victim assistance programs had provided additional financial support. Most importantly, publishers and film production companies were already expressing interest in telling her story, which would provide long-term financial security for her and Hope. Rosa and Maria were waiting in the hospital lobby when Emma emerged with her daughter. Both women had taken time off from work to be there, and their faces showed the mixture of joy and vindication that Emma felt herself. Mija, Rosa said, embracing Emma carefully to avoid disturbing the sleeping baby. You did something incredible. We all did something incredible, Emma corrected. None of this would have been possible without your help and friendship. What will you do now? Maria asked. I'm going back to Portland, Emma replied. I want to raise Hope in the city where her father lived and worked. But I also want to stay involved in advocating for worker rights. This case has shown me that there are still too many Marcus Blackwells in the world and too many workers who need protection. As they walked toward the hospital parking garage, Emma looked back at Millbrook Valley one last time. The apple orchards stretched across the landscape, their trees heavy with fruit that would soon be harvested by workers who now had stronger protections and better wages. The morning sun painted the scene in shades of gold and promise, and Emma felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. 6 months later, Emma stood before a federal courthouse in Portland as Marcus Blackwell was sentenced to 37 years in prison on charges that included murder, conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal labor laws. Hope, now healthy and alert, sat contentedly in her mother's arms as they watched justice finally being served. Blackwell's co-conspirators had received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. The deputy assistant secretary who had helped cover up the investigation had been sentenced to 15 years and banned from ever holding federal office again. The congressional staff member who had accepted bribes to influence legislation was facing similar charges in a separate trial. But perhaps most satisfying for Emma was the announcement that Sullivan Orchards and all other Blackwell agricultural facilities were being converted into worker-owned cooperatives, with the people who had actually labored in the fields becoming the owners and operators of the businesses they had built with their sweat and dedication. Agent Sutherland, whose cover identity as David Sullivan was no longer necessary, had been promoted and transferred to a new assignment investigating labor trafficking in the fishing industry. Before leaving Oregon, he had visited Emma and Hope one last time, bringing a gift that he said came from Michael's former colleagues at the Department of Labor. It was a small silver locket engraved with the words, "For Hope, may justice always light your way." Inside was a photograph of Michael that Emma had never seen before, showing him smiling with the confidence of a man who knew he was fighting for something larger than himself. As Emma fastened the locket around her daughter's neck, she thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a desperate application for apple-picking work and had ended with the exposure of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. It had cost Michael his life, but it had also ensured that Hope would grow up in a world where corporations couldn't murder whistleblowers with impunity. Standing on the courthouse steps with her daughter in her arms, Emma looked up at the clear Oregon sky and whispered a promise to the husband she would always love. "She'll know what you did, Michael. She'll know that her father was a hero." The baby gurgled contentedly and grasped the locket with tiny fingers, as if already understanding the precious legacy she had inherited. Around them, the world continued its daily rhythm, but for Emma and Hope Chun, justice had finally been harvested from the orchards of corruption that had claimed so many lives. The story that had begun with a pregnant widow seeking work had ended with the birth of a new generation that would grow up knowing that truth and courage could triumph over wealth and power. It was the greatest gift Michael could have given his daughter, and the most fitting memorial Emma could have built for the man who had loved them both enough to die for their future. Hope Michelle Chun would indeed grow up in a better world, and she would carry her father's legacy of courage into whatever battles awaited her generation. The harvest of justice was complete, but the seeds of change would continue growing for years to come. 2 years had passed since the courthouse steps where justice had finally been served, and Emma Chin found herself standing in a place she never could have imagined during those desperate days at Sullivan Orchards. The renovated community center in Millbrook Valley bustled with activity as dozens of former agricultural workers attended the inaugural meeting of the Pacific Northwest Worker Advocacy Coalition, an organization Emma had founded with the settlement. Money from the Blackwell case. Hope toddled between the folding chairs, her silver locket catching the afternoon light as she explored this room full of people who had become extended family. At 2 years old, she was already showing signs of her father's analytical mind and her mother's determination, carefully observing everything around her with bright, curious eyes. Rosa Martinez, now in her 3rd year as president of the Sullivan Orchards Worker Cooperative, approached Emma with a warm smile and a steaming cup of coffee. The transformation in Rosa's appearance was remarkable. The worry lines that had creased her face during the Blackwell years had softened, replaced by the confident bearing of a woman who finally had control over her own working conditions. "The turnout is better than we hoped," Rosa said, gesturing toward the packed room. Representatives from 12 different facilities, plus the journalists from Portland and Seattle. Emma nodded, feeling a familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement that accompanied these advocacy events. Michael would have loved seeing this. All these people who were once afraid to speak up, now organizing to protect others. He did see this, Rosa replied gently. Every time we negotiate better working conditions, every time we prevent another company from exploiting vulnerable people, he's seeing it through what we do. The meeting officially began with Maria Rodriguez, now the Cooperative Safety Coordinator, presenting a comprehensive report on working conditions improvements. Across the region, the statistics were encouraging. Workplace injuries down 60%, wages increased by an average of 40%, housing conditions meeting or exceeding federal standards at all formerly Blackwell-controlled facilities. But it was the personal testimonies that truly captured the scope of change that had rippled outward from Emma's brave decision to continue Michael's investigation. Isabella Santos, who had found the courage to leave her position as Blackwell's assistant and was now studying labor law at Portland State University, spoke about the scholarship fund that had been established for children of agricultural workers. 3 years ago, I was terrified to speak the truth, Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Today, I'm preparing to become a lawyer who will fight for workers' rights. That transformation happened because one pregnant woman refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. The applause that followed was heartfelt and sustained, but Emma felt uncomfortable with the attention. She had learned to accept recognition for her role in exposing the Blackwell conspiracy, but she always tried to redirect focus toward the systemic changes that were the real victory. When her turn came to address the gathering, Emma carried hope to the front of the room, using her daughter's presence to ground herself in the purpose that drove all her advocacy work. When I first came to Sullivan Orchards, I was desperate and alone, with nowhere else to turn. I thought I was just looking for a job that would help me survive until my baby was born. She paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years, workers who had shared their stories, journalists who had helped expose the truth, federal agents who had built the case that brought down Blackwell's empire. What I found instead was a community of people who refused to accept that exploitation was just the price of survival. You welcomed a stranger, protected me when I was vulnerable, and gave me the courage to honor my husband's sacrifice. Hope babbled something that sounded like agreement, drawing chuckles from the audience and helping to ease the emotional weight of Emma's words. The Blackwell case was just the beginning. Across the country, there are still companies that view workers as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of dignity and protection. Our job isn't finished until every person who labors to feed our families can do so safely and with fair compensation. Dr. James Mitchell, the physician who had cleared Emma for work at the orchard and who had become one of the coalition's most effective advocates for healthcare access, stood to present the medical clinic initiative that would bring comprehensive healthcare services directly to agricultural communities. The clinic, funded partially by the Victim Compensation Fund and partially by federal grants, would ensure that workers never again had to choose between seeking medical care and keeping their jobs. This clinic represents something unprecedented, Dr. Mitchell explained. Healthcare that's designed around the reality of agricultural work schedules, with staff who understand the unique challenges faced by migrant and seasonal workers. We're not just treating injuries and illnesses, we're preventing them through education and proactive care. Agent Sutherland, who had taken leave from federal service to help establish the coalition's legal advocacy program, presented updates on ongoing investigations that had grown out of the Blackwell case. The evidence Michael had gathered had opened doors to exposing similar operations across multiple states, leading to prosecutions and reforms that had protected thousands of additional workers. The ripple effects continue to expand, Sutherland reported. Federal agencies are now conducting surprise inspections at agricultural facilities nationwide. Congress has passed the strongest worker protection legislation in decades, and companies are discovering that the financial penalties for exploiting workers far outweigh any short-term profits they might gain. As the formal presentations concluded, and people began to mingle over the refreshments that had been donated by local businesses, Emma found herself in conversation with a young journalist from the Washington Post who was writing a follow-up story about the long-term impact of the Blackwell investigation. What do you think Michael would say if he could see what's happened? The journalist asked. Emma considered the question carefully, watching Hope play with a group of other children whose parents had all been touched by the events at Sullivan Orchards. I think he would be amazed by how many people found the courage to speak truth to power once they realized they weren't alone. Michael's investigation gave people hope that change was possible, but the real transformation happened because ordinary people decided to become extraordinary advocates for justice. The journalist scribbled notes, then looked up with another question. Do you ever regret the path that brought you here? The danger, the sacrifice, the upheaval? Never, Emma replied without hesitation. Not for a single moment. Hope will grow up in a world where workers have stronger protections because of what her father started and what this community finished. That's worth every risk we took. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, Emma helped with cleanup while Hope napped in her stroller. The community center gradually emptied, but the energy and determination that had filled the room seemed to linger in the air like a promise of continued action. Rosa was among the last to leave, pausing to embrace Emma warmly. Same time next quarter? She asked. Absolutely. And Rosa, thank you for everything. None of this would have been possible without your friendship and courage. We're family. Now, Mija. That's what family does for each other. As Emma loaded Hope into her car for the drive back to Portland, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a desperate search for employment had evolved into a life dedicated to ensuring that other families never faced the choices she had been forced to make. The Portland skyline came into view as they crested the hills surrounding Millbrook Valley, and Emma felt the familiar sense of coming home. The apartment she shared with Hope was modest but comfortable, filled with photographs of Michael and mementos from their advocacy work. It was a place where Hope could grow up surrounded by reminders of her father's courage and her mother's determination to honor his memory. That evening, as Emma tucked Hope into her crib, she noticed her daughter clutching the silver locket. That had become her most treasured possession. Inside the locket, Michael's photograph had been joined by a small image of Hope herself, creating a visual connection between father and daughter that transcended the tragedy of his absence. Daddy would be so proud of you, sweetheart, Emma whispered, stroking Hope's dark hair. And he would be proud of what we've accomplished together. Hope's eyes were already closing, but she smiled at the sound of her mother's voice, her tiny fingers maintaining their grip on the locket even as sleep claimed her. Emma settled into the rocking chair beside the crib, a chair that had belonged to Michael's mother and had been passed down through 3 generations. It was here that she often found herself at the end of difficult days, reflecting on the path that had led them to this peaceful moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A conference call with federal legislators about proposed agricultural labor reforms, a meeting with documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell their story, correspondence with other advocacy organizations across the country. The work of justice was never finished, requiring constant vigilance and continued courage from people willing to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. But tonight, in the quiet of their home, Emma allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of promises kept and duties fulfilled. Michael's sacrifice had not been in vain. Hope would indeed grow up in a better world. And the harvest of justice that had begun in those apple orchards would continue to nourish positive change for generations to come. The silver locket gleamed softly in the nightlight's glow, a talisman of love and legacy that would guide Hope through whatever challenges awaited her. She was Michael's daughter and Emma's daughter, heir to a tradition of courage that would serve her well in whatever battles she chose to fight. Outside the apartment window, Portland's lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a life that had been touched by the events that began with a pregnant widow's application for apple-picking work. The city hummed with the quiet energy of people building better tomorrows, and Emma Chin smiled as she rocked gently in her chair, knowing that she and Hope were part of that great work of justice and hope. The story that had begun in desperation had ended in triumph. But more importantly, it had planted seeds of change that would continue growing long after Emma and Hope were gone. That was Michael's true legacy, not just the exposure of one conspiracy, but the inspiration for countless acts of courage that would protect the vulnerable and speak truth to power. Hope stirred in her sleep, her small hand opening to release the locket, which fell gently onto the soft blanket. Emma smiled and closed her own eyes, grateful for the peace that justice had finally brought to their lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.